.NET Aspire with AZD and Bicep with James Montemagno.
The Azure DevOps Podcast is a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Each show brings you hard-hitting interviews with industry experts, innovating better methods, and sharing success stories. Listen on to learn how to increase quality, ship quickly, and operate well. And now your host, Jeffrey Palermo.
Welcome to the show. I'm Jeffrey Palermo, your host for helping you and your teams move fast and deliver quality and to run your software with confidence in Azure, all while using everything that the .NET ecosystem has to offer. The podcast is sponsored by ClearMeasure, which is a full-service software architecture and engineering firm that serves companies using .NET, Azure, and all things Microsoft. We build Microsoft or mission-critical software and rescue failing projects and empower software delivery with a proven approach. Quick announcement, I'm excited that my latest book is now fully released. This book is about software leadership. It's called The 5 Pillars, Leadership for Effective Custom Software. And this book is for anyone who's attempting to make a custom software team highly effective. And if you want your team to deliver world-class results, then this book could be for you. Teams are also doing book studies and discussions around it. We have a book study guide, and I'm excited about that. And so if you, dear listener, would like a complimentary electronic copy of the book, then you can just send me an email and I'll make sure to get that to you. And for those of you who are in a lead architect or software executive role, you might want to join our monthly forums. These are interactive and deeply technical sessions that I enjoy facilitating myself. It's a video meeting essentially with peers who are leading groups of developers. You can sign up for those at clearmeasure.com. I have a returning guest on the show from way back in episode 62, James Montemagno, and he is a principal lead program manager for developer community at Microsoft. He's been a .NET developer since 2005, working in a wide range of industries, including game development, printer software, and web services. And prior to becoming a principal program manager, James was a professional mobile developer and has now been crafting apps since 2011 with Xamarin, now Maui. And in his spare time, he's most likely cycling around Seattle or guzzling gallons of coffee at a local coffee shop. And he co-hosts the weekly development podcast Merge Conflict. You can find that at mergeconflict.fm. And he also has a well-populated YouTube channel that James Montemagno will include all the links in the show notes. But James, welcome back to the show. How are you, sir?
Yeah, I'm doing fantastic. Yeah, it's good to be back. What did I even talk about like 18 years ago? What was even happening then? I don't even remember.
We were talking about the Xamarin development cycle and how to set up development environments and tests and deploying for Xamarin apps.
Oh, cool. Wow. Yeah. It's been a while because I've been doing it now for so long. Like, yeah, it has been over 13 years that I've been doing mobile development with .NET. And desktop development as well. I mean, desktop development for way before that as well, when I got into it in 2005. So in that space. But yeah, it's cool because, the spaces have evolved quite a bit, but the core concepts, I bet if you went and listen back to it, maybe some of the services have changed. Like maybe there's, new things in Azure DevOps, or there's new things in GitHub Actions, for example. But I bet a lot of the core concepts still apply, which is really awesome. So that's cool.
Oh yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, you recently did a presentation at the .NET Aspire Day where you were focusing on the automation side, the integration with the Azure Developer Console and the bicep templates and spinning up using the infrastructure as code concepts, spinning up environments in Azure for .NET Aspire apps. And you've also done a lot of talk around where Maui fits in with Aspire and all that. And that's a really interesting angle. Now, there's a lot of work being done. And I thought, man, I want to pick your brain on that and make sure our listeners are kind of up to speed with this. But I'll just ask you, because we had other guests talking about Aspire. When it comes to the automation side, what's the state of that? What scenarios are like ready to go now? And what scenarios, of course, are being worked on, just so that listeners kind of get a good understanding of that.
Yeah, let's zoom back, right, for a little bit. Like, I think for me, as someone that comes from a client side development, I've really, my team focuses on building developer communities around all of our products. We have people focus on all sorts of different things from Visual Studio, VS Code, Python, .NET, Playwright and JavaScript, all these different things, and how they all work together as well in these pipelines. And for me, I've obviously talked a lot about mobile development and client development, talked a lot about web development and hybrid development now with Blazor Hybrid. And, the cool part of all of those scenarios are these backend services, your backends or your front ends, you have your reverse proxies, you have your APIs, you have your integrations into SignalR or RabbitMQ, all these different things when you're building a real application, right? And also real applications, by the way, can just be a backend or just a front end, right? Like I want to zoom back out because I think when people hear about .NET Aspire, they read or they see a sample, it's pitched in many different ways. And I think the .NET Aspire team and even how I talk about it inherently and how I've done videos on it have changed and morphed since it first launched just in May of 2024. So just at build. So 7 months ago of recording this podcast before the holidays. So really, when you think about it, it's really a set of tools and libraries and infrastructure for building better apps. That's what I like to say. It handles all of the complexity of things that every application needs to make your developer life better and optionally your deployment life easier as well in a few different scenarios. So when I talk about Aspire, I say, let me first talk about solving developer and app problems. One is like, I have multiple projects. How do I spin up all of them? How do I see my logs? How do I see my telemetry? How do I make sure that my apps are resilient? So if I have flaky internet or one backend goes down, that my apps still stay up so they retry automatically. Well, .NET Aspire handles that because it orchestrates your projects in your application. So it has an app host project that orchestrates your other projects that you're deploying or building, let's say a backend and a front end. And it will spin up both of those. So instead of doing a multi-project startup or starting a bunch of different things in Visual Studio or VS Code or the command line, you just run the app host. The app host basically generates and knows what's inside of it. Think of it as like code as infrastructure, and then can build and compile and debug those and launch them. And instead of launching a bunch of terminal windows and a bunch of browser tabs, it opens this .NET Aspire dashboard. And that puppy is like what everyone sees. When they think of .NET Aspire, they're like, oh, the dashboard, right? And it shows you everything running, whether it be containers that .NET Aspire spun up automatically and downloaded for you into Docker or Podman, or like your backend or your front end or YARP. It'll show you everything, the IPs, it'll show you all the connection strings, it'll show you all of your logs, all of your traces, and all of these metrics, because .NET Aspire comes with sort of an opinionated set of defaults for all of your applications to opt into. We call them service defaults. And that'll configure service discovery, open telemetry. It'll configure resiliency all automatically, tests like health checks automatically for you. And then you can modify those to your liking, right? If you like what it does by default, rad. If not, totally cool, right? The cool part is that you're just adding these to your existing projects. So when we talk about deployment too, we talk about the pipelines, we talk about everything. The first thing I think is, let's just understand what .NET Aspire is and how it helps you be more productive and get more insight into your application on your local machine. And then there's this other part, which is like not on my machine, right? Which is like in the cloud, on-prem, somewhere else. So it's hard. It depends. What am I today? Am I a developer that is building a new application and I want some like guardrails to help me go off and do my job? Or do I already have a huge application or small application that's sort of deployed out into the world today? So that is sort of like the two scenarios for developers to think about. And the scale of those can be either huge enterprise, it uses containers, it does all this stuff, or it could just be like, hey, I just got a back end and a front end and app service. I'm like, this is great, right? Like all those things work. In fact, you might just have just the back end. Like that's okay. Maybe it's talking to a database, right? And the cool part about all of it is everything's optional. Everything I just told you, you can use a little of it, you can use some of it, you can use a lot of it, you can use all of it, right? So you are really in control of the span of .NET Aspire-ification of your applications. But just know that you're not building a .NET Aspire app. There is no app. There's no app workload. There's just a bunch of NuGet packages, to be honest with you. And .NET 9 it changed from a workload that you would install with .NET to just a bunch of NuGet packages, which is awesome. It makes it really easy to version and upgrade and opt into, which is cool. And then you decide, do I want some of my projects? Do I want all my projects in it? That's cool. And beyond that, just from a developer perspective, if you want to use some parts of Aspire just for like orchestration, you could change like 0 lines of code
Mm-hmm.
in your application, like none, right? You can change 0 parts of your deployment pipeline that you have today and take advantage of all the local development stuff. So I think often, especially when you hear like, Maddie or you hear like Fowler talk about it, there's still this demystification because when we developers are introduced to a new thing, we're like, whoa, like I want to use everything. And like, it's going to apply to every single scenario in the entire world. And it's going to be great because I want to use all the stuff. And then if it doesn't do your exact scenario, you're like, I can't use any of it.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So we're really trying to frame it in this like opt into the bits and pieces that fit your development lifecycle and also your deployment pipeline for what you need today. And it will continue to grow and add more scenarios. So give us the feedback. So that's my TLDR backup. Let's if someone's brand new, has no idea about Aspire, like what is going on? And that's my high level overview. And I have some great videos, and at .NET Conf there are great videos, and the documentation's amazing, and the samples are awesome. But sometimes you just see like a huge eShop, right? Like, oh man, I got like
Right. A lot of stuff in
1,000
there.
projects. The best demo that I've ever done, I think, is just like I got a back end, got a front end. It's what a lot of people are building, by the way.
Yep.
And like, maybe it uses a database, maybe it uses a cache. Let me show you how this thing makes your life better today in 10 minutes. And like, that's totally true. Like it's like 10 minutes tops to get this stuff integrated into your application. So which is cool. So anyways, that's the context. Now, Jeffrey, lead me deeper into whatever conversation you want to have about deployment.
I want to make a point because you said the simplest scenarios. There are a ton of development teams that have an application that essentially is a web application of some sort, a SQL Server database, and then some side job that does something on a scheduler or listening to a queue. I mean, that right there, just those 3 things are so common. And then applications kind of add on additional things, but those tend to be present all the time. You did mention a couple things. You mentioned Docker and you mentioned Podman. And I just want to make sure everyone understands the default supported ones. Are both those equally supported? Do you just pick one, or is Docker Desktop the favorite? How should developers think about that?
Well, so developers should first know that you don't have to use any containers.
Okay.
By the way, so containerization is completely optional, and really the containers are like, let's say you use Redis, right? You want to use a caching layer. You would pull down a container of Redis, right? Like you would pull that down. You need to run Redis somewhere. You could point at like Azure Redis, for example, like from your code. But as a developer, you probably want to like test locally. And that's where a container would need to run. So for example, if you want to pull down that, or you need to pull down some other image, like a RabbitMQ image, which is there. And they have all these integrations into .NET Aspire. So you don't need to figure out what package you need for Redis or for RabbitMQ or something like that. You can just pull the .NET Aspire NuGet package for Redis. And there's a host and a client package. And the host is that infrastructure. So you'd say, I have a new Redis cache, and then my backend is going to use that, or a SQL database is going to use that. And then on the client, so your backend or front end, you add the Redis Aspire package there, and that helps you connect the glue together and gives you helpers. The cool part there is that when you think of, let's say Redis, or let's say Postgres even, there is like the database, the cache, which are container images, but you might have kind of complementary services, like maybe a PG admin, for example, for Postgres, or you might have a Redis commander to give you a dashboard. The cool part about these integrations is that .NET Aspire and the app host will automatically pull those down for you. Like when I add a cache, I say with cache, give it a name, and say with Redis commander, right? And just like, boom, here it is. And the app host will automatically pull down those containers and run them on your machine. Today, the app host and the infrastructure supports Docker Desktop and Podman out of the box there. If you run Podman, you need to set an environment variable. So that way it knows how to do it. And I think that is it maybe even gotten more streamlined in .NET 9. I'd have to double check on the documentation that it's there. But there are other feature requests out there to support other container,
Runtime.
runtimes
Yeah.
that are
Okay.
out there as well. There's a few other popular ones that are out there too, but they're there. So if you can run Docker Desktop anywhere, you can do it. You run Podman anywhere, they're there. And I've been running all of this I have a Project Volterra machine. That's my daily driver, which is a Windows ARM machine.
Nice.
And Docker Desktop now does run there. But I've used Podman for a long time and Podman Desktop. And we actually have a .NET Aspire credential. It has a virtual lab, and that uses Podman, right? So they're very equally there for whatever you're using out there, which is great.
Okay, nice. There's so many demos already that are about the developer experience, which are really cool. I want to ask you about let's just say the DevOps automation umbrella for builds, testing, creating environments in Azure, unattended automated deployments to, environment 1, environment 2, environment 3, production. How should people be thinking about that? I know it's in the roadmap. Some things are working now, but let's start with the why, because it's not just on the developer workstation, but some of that vision is, hey, we'll even help you figure out how this should run in Azure. We'll generate some networking things,
You're telling me that people want to take their apps and then run them on the internet, Jeffrey? Is that what you're saying?
It's a crazy idea.
It's a crazy idea. No, there's a few things. Like one thing is a big part of .NET Aspire is this kind of secure by default as well. So a lot of the best practices are set up in these defaults automatically for you. And the team wants to apply those same concepts to deployment as well. So I want to talk about deployment again, zoom back in a few ways, because I think there's so much confusion out there. Because if you were to survey every listener and viewer right now, just think about this. What is your application? How many services is it? How are you deploying it? Where are you deploying it? Is it on-prem? Is it in Azure? Is it in Google? Is it in AWS? What other ancillary services are you using? Every single person. Is it Kubernetes? Is it using Helm charts? Is it using App Service? Is it using ACA? Is it using, container registry? Is it using Docker registry? Everybody's different, right?
Yep.
There's no two applications that are exactly the same, which makes it kind of complicated, right? Like deployment in general doesn't have to be complicated, but it can be complicated when you have many interwoven parts. So the .NET Aspire team, really in the messaging, and what I've said, what Maddie, what Dave, what Damien, everyone else said is like, if you have an application today, just keep deploying it as is.
Yeah.
Like you don't have to change anything. Keep using all of your connection strings. Use all of your Helm charts. Use all of any Kubernetes deployments that you're doing, your app service deployments that you're doing. Like just deploy. It's going to work the same. Like when you are using, for example, these integrations, it does set up certain connection strings for service discovery, but you don't have to use those. Those are optional as well. You can use your own connection string and pipe it in. Like there's always a way, right? There's just a Redis cache somewhere on the internet. You would just point that in a connection string like always. So while you can opt into these services, know that like when you build and you say, hey, my front end uses my back end, and just use like API and figure out the local host and the port for me automatically, that will, still work. And because it gives you a connection string to set up locally and when you deploy. So all those things are available. And of course, you can opt out of those features when you go to deploy too. There's a few things. Like one, if you're all in on Azure, rad, there's special integrations to help you sort of orchestrate your Azure deployments and resource creation in code. So for all the different integrations that are out there, so for example, Cosmos DB, Event Hubs, Key Vault, OpenAI, SignalR, Service Bus, all these things, there's special hosting packages that basically enable you to do local Azuring provisioning and use Azure like emulators on your local machine. And it can basically set everything up for you automatically. You can point it at existing Azure resources. So when you hit F5, it's actually speaking to your Azure backends. Maybe you have an if debug, if release, you're doing different things maybe locally versus Azure there, and can figure it all out for you automatically. They have a new is publish mode option.
Mm-hmm.
So you can say, if I'm publishing my app, use Azure Key Vault, but if I'm just on my local machine, use connection strings. So you have these options in general, which is really nice. But from a high level, if you take it back, I think that there's like 3 modes that you can go into. One mode is, I'm just going to keep deploying as is today. I have all my connection strings, I have all my infrastructure, I have all my CI/CD set up, all my testing. Awesome. Everything is set up automatically. Maybe I want to add in some integration tests. Like that could be an option too. Like maybe I want to basically take what's on my dev machine and I want to be able to like deploy that and run integration tests. Like there's full integration test support in .NET Aspire that you can run locally, or like in Azure DevOps, for example, runs in MS Test, NUnit, XUnit, anything like that. And that's going to be like, hey, like what happens if my back end or my front end, like all the things talking together, kind of hit my endpoints because all my things are started up. But when I go to deploy, like that's one option. Just keep deploying as is today. I don't need to change any infrastructure. Maybe I change a few connection strings. Maybe add a few new connection strings. So I'm opting into some of this niceness. The second part is like, hey, I want to go. So that first scenario is good if you're using app service, Kubernetes service, any of these other things. The other option mode is like, hey, I want to take my application that's new, I haven't deployed it anywhere yet, and I want the easy mode, right? Give me the deploy, right click publish. Just give me right click publish, right? Like let me go somewhere. And this is where sort of this could be amazing for dev or test or for production, right? Sometimes as a developer, I have all my, my infra set up and I'm like, cool, it runs on my machine, but like, can I right click deploy the entire thing right now? And will it still work? Right. And then also, can I take that and then can I move that environment into production, for example, right? And flip those bits over. So today, how that works is a combination of 2 parts, basically. First is that .NET Aspire has this concept of a manifest. And you can think of it as a big JSON file. No, it's like one, there is no YAML, right? So like when you think of like, Docker stuff, we're thinking of like Docker Compose files and things like that. And then we're building things up. And that's like what I'm deploying and how things are configured. Well, the code in your app host is telling it, I have a Redis cache. I have a backend service, and my backend and my front end service use that cache and that API service. So what you can do is when you say .NET publish, or even .NET run, it basically generates this big JSON file, which is a .NET Aspire manifest. Most developers will never see this, to be honest with you. It's transparent to you. But behind the scenes, it is creating a blueprint for your house, right? For your application, for your full deployment that's out there. It's saying, hey, this is the name of the Redis. This is the image of the Redis. This is the project for my backend service. This is the front end. These are the connections. These are the ports that I've specified that it's going to run on. Here are all the connection strings for open telemetry or to be able to communicate across each other. So it builds this big JSON file. And then with that file, other tools can use it to deploy applications into different environments. Okay. And what most people see is either like AZD init and AZD up with the Azure Developer CLI, or they'll see a right click publish in Visual Studio, which uses the Azure Developer CLI to deploy this application to Azure. And when I mean application, I mean your entire solution, right? So the app host says, hey, here's all of the projects to deploy and here's how they're configured. Like the app host at that point is done, right? Once it generates the JSON file, its job is done. It is saying, here is the blueprint for what to deploy, and then other tools take it. So there is basically 2 tools that do that today. One is from Microsoft, Azure Developer CLI, and there's another one called Aspirate, and that is a community tool that helps you do Kubernetes deployments and other types of deployments too, which is really cool. And all those 2 tools are saying, hey, generate this manifest and I'm going to go do stuff with it, which is cool. So how that works in practice, or for example, even in CI/CD, is you you pretty much just call AZD init and AZD up, and it will know to automatically deploy and configure stuff. And obviously, in your pipeline, you're going to configure other flags to pass into that, whether it be like the resource group or the different things that you're deploying into, like in CI/CD. And we have great documentation about using AZD and CI/CD. But inherently, what it's doing, whether it's in GitHub Actions or Azure Pipelines, is it is going to call those commands. And the first thing it's going to do is say, hey, give me the manifest. And then it's going to say, okay, what do we want to do with it?
Mm-hmm.
Right. And what it's doing at that point is it's saying, AZD, what do you support today for this .NET Aspire solution? And today, as of time of recording this on December 18th, 2024, because everything changes, is it supports Azure Container Apps.
Mm-hmm.
So you can think of that. I like to think of it as like, I know nothing about Kubernetes at all, but like Azure Container Apps lets me do all, it handles all the craziness of Kubernetes that I never want to learn about,
Yeah.
and puts kind of it in more of an easier, flexible way where I can easily configure multiple containers that are living in registries, scale them up, scale them down, figure out the resources, and go. That's how I look at ACA from a high level. I'm not really a cloud native expert, right? I'm a client developer, but that would be my easy go button. And when you think about it, it kind of makes sense because one, we have containers, like we have an, let's say you didn't use Azure Redis, for example, but you wanted to use your own Redis container. That's a container. So you have that. Any .NET app or web app or service can be containerized with .NET Publish. And now you have a container, right? A Linux or a Windows container. And then they can all be deployed and they can all be configured. So for right now, that's the mode that it's in, to be able to take that application, create containers for everything, and then automatically publish everything to Azure Container Registry, and then deploy all of that into Azure Container Apps for you automatically with just a few keystrokes. And that exact same integration pipeline can be done basically inside of a deployment pipeline, or inside of GitHub Actions, for example. And the cool part here is that in that YAML sort of pipeline that you have, is you do define like, let me, get .NET set up, let me get, these different things set up. You're probably going to set a few variables like your subscription ID and your environment name and your location. And these are things, if you ran the command line, you would enter.
Mm-hmm.
So you basically pass these environment variables to AZD. So you might have a subscription for dev tests, you might have one for prod, or different environment names or locations. Those are just environment variables for a task for the Azure CLI, basically. And you would pipe it into it and then let it go off and do its thing. And it's going to then take everything and make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And the cool part about that, what's actually happening, the third step, is that part of that AZD init and AZD deploy is it's actually creating all of the bicep infrastructure to deploy it, right? Because bicep is the native language of Azure, right? When you think about it, right? There's the ARM, but there's also bicep, and bicep is going to basically say, hey, here's everything that was in that manifest, and here is the representation to deploy those to Azure Container Registry, and also into Azure Container Apps. Oh, also, by the way, we'll set up a key vault for you, and we'll figure and do all the secure stuff for you automatically. So it is going to create all that for you automatically behind the scenes. The cool part is that all of these steps are available to you as a developer. Like you can say .NET Publish, give me the manifest, and it'll just give you the manifest. When you say AZD, you can say AZD infra synth, which is a key command which says, hey, AZD, don't actually publish this,
Mm-hmm.
but show me behind the hood what you're going to do, which is really nice, because you could literally then take that and then give it to, you could check that into source code technically, and then you could use that bicep as your deployment. You could customize it as you like. Now, every time you run AZD in and AZD deploy, it's going to regenerate it,
Mm-hmm.
right, for you. But like, you may only need to change those things so often when you're adding new services or new backends, but all that infra as code is there. So it's flexible as far as that goes, which is nice. Now, you may use that for dev tests. You may use that for, prod. If you want to go all in on ACA, you may, decide to go that route. But maybe you're like, hey, I actually have everything set up in this huge, crazy, Kubernetes cluster, everything that I have for deployment. I have all my scripts, but it would be really cool if I didn't have to go through that entire work and spin up
Yeah.
all that to get a test scenario up and running, where it doesn't maybe need to be a one-to-one. Again, I'm not like a enterprise. I need to replicate my
Right.
entire environment. Everyone's different, right? But like, hey, I'm a developer, AZD up. Cool. Let me just see my app running. Like, does it work?
Right.
Because
Right.
ideally, if it's running in ACA or it's running in these deployed things, ideally they're all working together. So some options there, I guess. And there's my 28-minute spiel about deployment.
Well, I want to ask about the vision of how far y'all Microsoft is trying to go with this, because assuming to get started, okay, you need to provide your own subscription. We're not going to create a subscription for you, command line in some way. But there's always this parent-child or two levels of resources. One is, okay, you need to have some things in the subscription. Maybe the Azure Container Registry. Maybe you have, one container registry for the whole team or major piece of software, and we're going to pull container images from there, regardless of what environment we're deploying to, test, prod, development. But then other times we have infrastructure where the assumption is this belongs to a environment. This is the dev environment. This is the staging environment. This is production environment. So what's the thinking to be able to describe things that are part of an environment versus things that are at the level above all of the environments that you have, kind of at your team level?
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. Like right now, I think from like the deployment perspective, like how it's set up inherently is more of like take the whole thing, deploy all the different bits and pieces that are there. That being said, it's code, right?
Mm-hmm.
So your code can do anything. You can conditionally compile anything. You can have a pound if test, pound if dev, and different pieces and different parts can be configured differently based on those environments that are there. Like I said, you might have one that's like, hey, in production, actually go use these Azure services, but when I'm in dev or test, let me just run locally, right? Or even use an emulator on my local machine instead of using a real full deployed resource in Azure, for example. So that gives you some flexibility there to say, okay, yeah, I want to just deploy this little bit, but the actual code is going to tell me what it's going to do. So if you think about it that way, which is instead of saying, okay, I have a bunch of different, YAML files and deploy scripts that are sending it into different places, like your code is telling it what to do.
Okay. So
right?
It sounds like without custom code, the assumption is we're operating within an environment, and anything that's outside of that scope, we just need to have set up already in some other manner. Is that a fair assumption?
Yeah, I think it's a relatively fair assumption. There are, for example, the integrations for Azure, for example, like the Cosmos and the Event Hubs and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Those will like sit and they'll provision things automatically for you. So you can give it, for example, like resource groups, and you can give it names, and you can give it a bunch of other stuff, and you can say, oh, here's my connection strings, here's not my connection string, run as an emulator, don't run as an emulator. And you can take it and you can have it provision those automatically for you when you run it on your local machine or when you run it into a dev test environment. So for example, you might say, hey, like I actually have this test, Azure Redis Cache set up.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm running in test and I deploy this thing, go use that thing over there. And if it doesn't exist, it'll go create that thing with that name for you automatically inside of your resource group. So you have that flexibility that it will try to do those things for those types of scenarios.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just for the listener, picking a few things that you mentioned, the ARM templates that have been there for forever, and then bicep. Should we assume that bicep is part of the scope of the ARM, or is that just a play on words?
I don't know. I don't know.
Or is it a total replacement? Is it a total replacement for what ARM was used for?
I don't think so. I mean, I feel like you often see bicep and ARM, in a lot of different examples. I think there's have similar but different use cases. Like I don't, I'm not going to speak to the teams that build those things. That's above my pay grade of what I do.
Yeah.
But for this scenario, I think like the team, like the the .NET Aspire team, the Visual Studio team, the AZD team, the Bicep team, like the Azure, they all work really close together. The ACA team, and they say, okay, what's sort of this scenario look like for them to support? I mean,
Okay.
it's not unreasonable that based on enough developer demand, if those outputs are beneficial to have ARM or have something else, that it could go down that route in the future, right? But like any good software, it has to start somewhere, right? It
Yeah.
has to grow and add more features later on. You can't be 100% feature complete
Sure.
on day one.
Well, a
So
lot of these concepts, it's kind of pulling the .NET developer into the cloud sysadmin world and exposing, and a lot of developers that haven't had to do these things before. And like if you go to the Azure portal and create something, it still provides, hey, download the ARM, the Azure Resource Manager template. So you got Azure talking one language, and then you got the bicep, and so that just understanding the relationship is just a new concept for a lot of developers. But either way, this is it's growing it's growing the term full stack developer. It's like, what does that mean? Oh, it includes more stuff now.
yeah, totally. It does include a lot more things, and I think that I think from a high level, like for me as a developer that does use a lot of Azure, that's not maybe a sysadmin or an IT admin, or really wants to understand all the complexity of it, like
Yeah.
there is that easy button for me. It's kind of like why I love Azure Functions, by the way. Like I'm a huge Azure Functions fan, and like that's now
Just works.
can be added into the Aspire project app post that you have set up. There's special like scaffolding for that, which is cool. For me, like I love Azure Functions because it handles a lot of that complexity for me. Like I want to run, like it's easier than app service in some cases for me because I don't have to worry about servers and all that stuff. It's like go do it, which is great for some of my apps. Where other ones I need kind of more fuller, richer, different functionality. And ACA, for example, for me makes a lot of sense because I, as a developer, I'm like, I want to see my app out here growing and running, and I want to get off running quickly. And I'm not, maybe don't need the full complexity and power. I should say complexity, but it's more complex than ACA of Kubernetes service, for example. And maybe ACA is great for me. But I can see the team having, while there's one deployment option today, a lot more. But I think that's why when I almost like actually hate demoing deployment, to be honest with you, because I feel like there's a bajillion questions right away.
Yeah.
And while they are important, right? And we have great docs. Like there's literally one that's like deploy ACA using AZD, do this using Visual Studio. Here's in depth. Here's this. Here's Apps Insights. Here's SQL databases and Redis. Like there's a great documentation. The question is when you're just learning about it and you're just getting started, it can immediately be like, okay, but like, is this for me? Because like I have this thing already, which is like, we always say the first thing, hey, you already have ARM, you already have Bicep, you already have Helm, you already have your Docker. So yeah, just keep using that. You're totally fine, right? It's going to keep working as is. But from a developer perspective, I can think about how great it is that I get more productivity that's there. The other benefit too, by the way, is that the .NET Aspire dashboard also can run and be deployed standalone. So in the right-click publish AZD up example there, when it puts it in Azure Container Apps, it also deploys the Azure or the .NET Aspire dashboard for you, and it will configure your OpenTelemetry endpoints to pipe into the dashboard. The cool part is that once you have OpenTelemetry in your applications, which maybe you never did before, or maybe you do, yeah, you can create a Grafana dashboard, for example, which would be awesome for production. But also, you might want something internal that's like lower lift, less configuration, just gives you what you had on your local dev machine on internal prem or maybe somewhere else. It's just a container image, just an image that you can pull down and deploy that anywhere. You can actually go to aspiredashboard.com. It's a small little GitHub Pages thing that few folks, including myself on the team, worked on, and it shows you. There's great documentation. Aspiredashboard.com. It shows you like, yeah, just run these, PowerShell or Bash commands. You can run it locally on your machine. And this is cool too because while we were talking a lot about .NET, maybe have some Python applications. Maybe you have JavaScript applications, and maybe they have OpenTelemetry. Those developers at your company or your friends, they can just use the Aspire dashboard on their local machine, just run it. And all of their OpenTelemetry data can be piped into that dashboard so they can see it, and they could deploy it
Nice.
as well and just set the connection strings automatically, however you're deploying it today, and see it, which is really cool. As a great option that's there too. And beyond that, .NET Aspire can not only just orchestrate .NET applications, but in a .NET Aspire project where you're orchestrating your Redis and your back and your front end, you can add Python, you can add JavaScript, you can add Go, and you can add all these different things. And basically, that manifest will boot up and say, okay,
Mm-hmm.
like go run npm run this thing, right? And it'll run it, right? It's not going to know how to debug it or things, but it'll pull it all together. So in that dashboard, you can see your entire project working together. If you're Polyglot, for example.
Yeah, yeah. Well, speaking of Polyglot, and probably the last question as we kind of close up here, since you spent so much time doing Maui and client applications, so many of the Aspire applications, the client is a browser web app of some sort, the simple Blazor template. I haven't seen, maybe they're out there, but I haven't seen a .NET Aspire layout Visual Studio solution that has a Maui project in it. And is that just, I haven't seen it yet, or is that not a scenario? Where does that fit when someone says, I have this application, it's a distributed application, but I kind of want to have, some Android screens or some iOS screens, and they're just calling the web services that are this in this other project. How do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a great question. When I think it comes to client apps, there are some samples on GitHub. There's like a Aspire samples repo, and there's a client app folder, and that has like a WinForms, a WPF, and a UWP setup to do. And the question is like, what are you trying to do with it, right? Like when you run the app host, it runs everything, right?
Yeah.
So if you did have like a WPF app, it'd be like, okay, like I want to start my WPF app, and like I also I want my WPF app to know about these connection strings in some fashion,
Mm-hmm.
in dependency injection or things like that. I think when it comes to the web, it's pretty easy because like you're running this thing and it runs in the web, it's there. When it comes to Maui, there's a few things. There's the service discovery part. There is the booting up the project, right? That's like, what do you want to boot? Is it iOS? Is it Android?
Mm-hmm.
And then also the logging and the telemetry is really important. So actually at Microsoft Build, Mark Rosinovich and Scott Hanselman demoed an AI-powered .NET Maui application to do like desktop organization and cleanup that was all powered by .NET Maui and .NET Aspire as well. Now, in that scenario, any of the backend services were inside of the .NET Aspire project. And then what that project was doing is you just run your Maui app and it took all of the open telemetry and it piped it into the dashboard, right? So you kind of two startup projects. That being said, on like the .NET YouTube, for example, there's a community stand-up probably from earlier this year, mid 2024,
Mm-hmm.
with some of the Aspire folks and some of the Maui folks and talking about what they're thinking about for that scenario and what's important. And there's some sample projects out there from some of the core engineers of like prototypes, basically. And what the current prototype does, I'm in a lot of threads about this because it really also interests me as well.
Yeah.
Is that when you build your Aspire app host, the current implementation is it will generate a bunch of code to configure your Maui app. And then you'd run your Maui app, based if you want iOS, Android, Windows, and it would know about your running services and be able to pipe things in for you automatically. So that's the current environment today. So again, you would think of the app host as like it's your configuration for everything. And then you run it and all of your services that your app's going to use. And then your Maui app would know about those things inherently. The problem inherently with that is HTTPS and localhost and Android emulators and all this other stuff. So I know the team is looking a little bit further on like using dev tunnels, for example, because historically, forever as a client developer, if you're just on Windows, like localhost works pretty good. But once you get into an iOS simulator or an iOS device or an Android device or an Android emulator, it's got to be deployed. It's got to be somewhere. It's kind of complicated.
Right.
But if you could dev tunnel your services, you could then pipe those dev tunnels, which basically gives, so people don't know dev tunnels, it's a reverse proxy of the tunnel. It's a reverse, it's a tunnel proxy from localhost to the internet, right? And it gives you a publicly accessible URL that can be public to everybody, anonymous, or it could be with authentication, and then that will tunnel it to your local machine. So I give you Jeffrey Palermo --testapi.com, .visualstudio.com, and then it goes to localhost port 1080, right? So that's what they're looking at. And I think you'll hear a lot more about that in 2025.
And then your mobile app can hit a URL that's actually going to your desktop. And if you put a token that's effectively close to a GUID, no one's going to guess it anyway, even if it is technically public for a few seconds.
Yeah, exactly. And that allows you to like test your solution that's out there, on your machine, which would be great. So I know the team's looking at a lot of those different scenarios. And it might be first like, hey, we'll just like configure some of these defaults for you and get open telemetry over here, right? But I think you'll see those scenarios continue as .NET Aspire evolves, and also the use cases evolve as well.
Nice. Well, that was a lot of good information, and we'll include a link to everything that we mentioned in the show notes for the listeners. But James, thanks for coming back onto the Azure and DevOps podcast to share with us all about .NET Aspire, Azure Developer Console, Bicep, Azure, and the Maui plans. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Always an honor and a pleasure over here. So anytime come back, talk about anything, I'm always down. So just let me know. And if everyone has any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Easiest way to do that is, I don't know, that's a good question. I'm not really on social media anymore. So I guess like LinkedIn, we have a big .NET group. Just like post something there, or hit me up on LinkedIn, or if you happen to just email me, james.montemagno@microsoft.com.
Fantastic.
Cool.
And until next time, dear listener, keep shipping.
You've been listening to the Azure DevOps Podcast, a show for developers and DevOps professionals shipping software using Microsoft technologies. Go to www.azuredevops.show for show notes and other episodes. On behalf of your host, Jeffrey Palermo, and our sponsors, thanks for listening, and may God bless you.